All right. Hello, everybody. This is your flip classroom video to accompany this section that you're going to be reading in class on Wednesday, September 23rd. If you don't have the Foner edition, just go by this subject heading in Chapter 2. So let's get started by talking about the Puritans. They were the first English settlers in the New England colonies, and they were called that because they sought to purify the Church of England. So in other words, they saw the Church of England as a watered-down version of Catholicism because it maintained many traditions that they rejected, such as sacraments, church hierarchies, and the idea that clergymen couldn't marry. They also believed that there should be a personal investment in religion. So they emphasized reading the Bible and attending sermons where Bible readership was emphasized over those other practices that I just mentioned above, the sacraments and things like that. And there were also different kinds of Puritans. So separatists wanted to completely break from the Church of England, but most Puritans actually believed that they could stay in the church and just modify it from within. But nonetheless, regardless of what kind of Puritan you were, even if you stayed in the Church of England, many of them faced a lot of persecution, especially after the year 1840, because when Charles I became King of England, he was a Catholic. And so many Protestants found that it was less safe for them to practice their religion freely in England. So that was a huge push factor for them to leave and try to settle in the Americas. They were also attracted to the Americas just because of this general idea that they could try to start a new society from scratch. The first governor in Massachusetts, John Winthrop, allegedly uttered this idea that Massachusetts could be a city upon a hill for all the world to see. Right, but what he actually meant by that statement has been reinterpreted over time. We'll talk more about it when we get to Reagan, of all things, later on in the year. But anyway, the idea of freedom was actually limited in the New England colonies. Just because they wanted to worship freely did not necessarily mean that everyone was free, right? So freedom really meant the freedom to exercise one's religion, Puritanism, rather than freedom to do or worship whatever you wanted. Okay, so the Pilgrims were the first people to arrive at Plymouth, which is where Cape Cod is in Massachusetts. They ended up there in 1620. They arrived on the ship the Mayflower. I'm sure you guys have all heard of that. And they made an agreement before they even landed at Plymouth. This agreement was called the Mayflower Compact. And it was the idea that they would set up a self-governing society with a fair and just system of laws, although again, fair and just to whom is a question we really want to continue to ask, and we'll talk more about that in class. It's also important for us to realize how complicated the relationship was with indigenous Americans. So first off, they settled in an area that had already been cleared out by a smallpox outbreak. And they still relied on Indians heavily for survival, especially their first winter or so. And then the first Thanksgiving story has been widely debated in recent years. It did occur in the fall of 1621. But contrary to some earlier opinions that the indigenous people of the area, the Wampanoags, contrary to the idea that they were invited, some historians argue actually it started with the firing of cannons and guns by the Puritans. They were doing this to celebrate a successful harvest, and the Wampanoags were alarmed by all the noise that they heard, and they showed up near the colony. Now, some argue that they were allowed to dine with the Pilgrims once they got there, but the idea that they were invited has been debated in recent years. So Thanksgiving, it's certainly a good example of early cross-cultural contact, but whether it was one of inclusion is one that we need to think about more. And also it's important for us to realize that it wasn't too long after this that you start to see a lot of violent confrontations between the English settlers and the indigenous Americans. So one example that comes to mind is the Pequot War in Connecticut in 1637, where essentially the Pequots were virtually wiped out from that area. Let's talk about the growth of New England. Now we have to migrate a little bit to Massachusetts Bay. It's not the same as Plymouth. So the Massachusetts Bay colony was a much larger and much more economically viable colony. And even though it was initially settled by Puritans, there were many non-Puritans that eventually start to populate that region, which eventually is going to cause a lot of tension. And we'll get there in a little bit. But Massachusetts Bay, again, was much larger than Plymouth Rock. Over 20,000 Puritans migrated to settlements in and around present-day Boston. And actually, that migration virtually ground to a halt in around the year 1640, 1642, and that was because the English Civil War started in England, and so it was much less safe to go on that journey, even though many of them probably wanted to leave. They just weren't able to. But still, before 1640, so many people migrated, and so many of them were families, right? So because there was a better balance of sexes in New England than there was in Virginia, the population just increased naturally, right? More families meant that it was much easier to just naturally increase the population, so they did not have to rely on immigration as much. Um, but nonetheless, we need to scrutinize the idea that it was an equal society, even though there was a greater emphasis on families. There was still a heavy reliance on indentured servitude and even slave labor, which is why I had you guys listen to that podcast, because Foner doesn't get into it. About 1/3 of the population of New England was actually servants and also slaves. And again, there were more women in New England, and some did gain some leadership positions, but still the primary role was domestic. They were expected to rear children, ultimately, above all else. Okay, let's talk a little bit about government in New England, and then we'll call it a day. So each town in New England was self-governing. It was centered around a congregational church. Each town has school, but the main purpose of the school was to educate them on how to read the Bible. This is an early primer where if you look at some of the text, you can see that that's what that's about. And also higher education was established relatively early in the colony. So Harvard was the first system of higher education to be founded in the Americas. It was founded in 1636, and it was a divinity school before anything else. Yale was founded in 1701, actually because they thought that Harvard was too liberal, which is interesting. The first governor of Massachusetts was actually elected directly by the people, which is a big difference from Virginia, because in Virginia, the governor was appointed by the king. So that could be seen as a little bit more democratic there. But only male members of the church were allowed to make key decisions. So not all residents in New England actually were church members. And of course, women did not have any decision-making authority. So anyone outside of the church could not participate in elections. So that made New England what's called a theocracy, or a church-led government. So inequality was ingrained in their earliest systems of government. And again, as I already mentioned, slavery was allowed under this system. So it's important for us to realize that just because they were self-governing, it does not mean that they were equal. Another thing that's really important about a theocracy is that church and state is not at all separate. In fact, the church thrived on collecting tax revenue. Any resident of a New England town, again, centered around the church, as you can see here, had to pay taxes that went towards the church. And also, those who strayed from the Puritan faith could be punished severely. Some of them were ostracized and excommunicated. We'll talk about Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson very soon. And also, some of them actually were even put to death. And the Salem witchcraft trials of the late 17th century are prominent examples of this. So because religious uniformity was required, New England cannot really be seen as a democratic society. And I'm going to leave it at that. Hopefully it better helps you understand that section that you read for asynchronous work today. And I will see you all in class on Thursday. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.